Give it up for Scott Lindberg.
So I started thrifting during my art student years in the 1980s, just looking for stuff I thought was cool. Over the years, I've slowly defined what this concept of cool is for me, and that's mid-century modern design. My interest in modernism began when I found a small set of Russell Wright plates in a thrift store up in Minneapolis. Wright's American Modern Dinnerware of 1939 was a huge breakthrough in casual dining and brought modernism to the masses. After I'd been collecting a while, I found out my grandparents owned a similar set when my parents were dating. Wright strongly believed that good design is for everyone, and his work touched virtually every segment of mid-century culture, including my family. Collecting Russell Wright started me down a path of obsession for modern dinnerware. I started buying designs by Ben Sabel, Ava Zeisel, David Gill, Paul McCobb, and pretty much anyone else producing designs with a modern aesthetic. More recently, I've also started to become interested in modernism placed into the context of location, particularly modern design coming from the Midwest. Marshall Studios was run by Jane and Gordon Martz only 60 miles from Champaign in Petersburg, Indiana. They produced their pieces by hand, and their shapes were purposefully simple, but their expressive decorations were obviously inspired by modern art, which is another of my passions. Fine art has a special appeal to me, and I look for it in thrift shops more than just about anything else. This 1968 print by Peter Bodner is my most recent thrift find. I picked it up last weekend here in town. Bodner was a local artist and a lithography professor at the University of Illinois. I really like how the line quality in his work here relates to the decoration of that Marshall Studios plate I just showed. And I wanted to show this slide just to prove that you can find old master prints in thrift stores too. This is an etching titled Bobalicon by the Spanish court painter Francisco Goya. It was etched in 1820 towards the end of his life and is considered among Goya's most surreal and conceptually modern works. And every so often you hear about someone finding a Picasso in a thrift store. Here's mine, a lithograph from 1954. When I first saw it, I was way up at the top of a wall in this little thrift shop in St. Paul, Minnesota. I couldn't see the price sticker, but asked an employee to get it down anyway. Turns out it was $6. Buying a Picasso for $6 is a no-brainer, but sometimes you just have to buy what you love. When I found this woodcut in a estate sale here in town, I had no idea who Dale Nichols was. I knew I just had to have it. I've since learned that Nichols was an American regionalist, and when I emailed this photo to a museum curator working on an exhibition of his work, she called me almost immediately. Turns out it's the only known example that she's seen, and it's going to be included in a book she's working on and coming out in May. Not everything I find has to have monetary value, though. This is my daughter, Izzy. She was 4 weeks old when we took her on her first thrift shopping trip, and found this candle holder by Danish designer Jens Quistgaard. It's a fairly unassuming piece, but special to me because it was Izzy's first thrift find. When we found out Izzy was going to be born, we decided we needed a rocking chair, and I already had this 1944 design by Hans Wegner in mind. We spent a couple months looking for one in thrift shops, but wound up doing something we never do. We paid full retail from upstate New York dealer. Not even 2 weeks later, I went on a thrifting trip to Springfield, Illinois, where after stopping a half a dozen or so pieces, I was getting frustrated I wasn't finding anything, which isn't uncommon for me. I can go for weeks without seeing anything interesting in a thrift store at all. So when I went into the Salvation Army and saw the second Wegner rocker, I learned a lesson: be persistent. I also learned that driving a two-door car is sometimes a bad idea. Here's Izzy a little bit more recently with some Alvar Aalto's children's stools that I picked up in a Chicago thrift store. Like other modern designers, Aalto was inspired by functionalism. So even these stools, even though these stools are made as children's furniture, they work equally as well for adults or even as tables. Sometimes a chair doesn't have to be a chair. And if you're going to talk about modern chairs, you can't leave out Charles Eames. I picked this one out of a junk shop in Minneapolis over a decade ago, and it's still one of my favorites. Eames is probably the first name people think of when modern design is mentioned, and he really summed up the philosophy well when he said, if it isn't functional, it isn't beautiful. And if we're going to talk about Charles Eames, we need to talk about his wife Ray as well. If Ray contributed anything to modern design, it's her stunning portfolio of textiles, including the pattern used on this tray called Sea Things. Ray designed it in 1947, and I think it proves that even the most die-hard modernists knew what they were doing with pattern and surface decoration. In fact, pattern was an important part of modern design. Vera Newman began her textile business by screen printing on surplus parachute silk in her kitchen. By the 1970s, she was responsible for literally thousands of patterns. My wife's 200-piece collection keeps growing, and if you're ever looking for me in a thrift shop, I'm probably that dude digging through the women's underwear bin looking for scarves. And since I'm a graphic designer, I'm also extremely interested in graphic design history. But when I first saw these two matchbooks in St. Joe, I couldn't place them. So I left them and drove 20 miles back home. When I got to my computer, I was reminded that they were a 1964 design by Saul Bass, the guy who designed all the Alfred Hitchcock movie intros. I drove back. Alex Steinweiss began his career as art director for Columbia Records in 1939. Before he began, album sleeves were simply plain paper wrappers. Steinweiss decided that using eye-catching graphics on album sleeves would increase sales. He was right, and this idea resulted in an 800% jump in revenue for Columbia. This next book I found is designed by Paul Rand. I found it at a garage sale here in town. The flat cut paper shapes and bold colors are typical of Rand's work. Like Steinweiss, Rand was trying to attract the buyer's eye, which is exactly what this design did for me. Just from the spine, I knew it was a great example of modern graphics. But I'd argue that while Rand was important, Alvin Lustig might even be more important. Lustig's work was radical in the 1940s when he began using simple graphic symbols on book covers instead of trying to retell the story with illustration. Lustig went blind and then died in 1955 at age 40. I can't help to think, but he still had lots left for us when he passed. This is just a little bit of what I've seen and found when I've been junk shopping. If you want to see more, visit my website, Ars Longa, at www.sllab.net. Just be careful, slab.com used to be a porn site.